Hi all! Today we're going to finish discussing the Chapter 8 of Introduction to Philosophy of Technology, entitled From Robotics and AI to Thinking About Moral Status and Human Relationships. Specifically, we're going to address two topics. First, a relational approach to a question regarding moral status, and second, the debate about sex robots. Let's begin with a relational approach to a question regarding moral status. Coeckelbergh have deconstructed the question regarding moral status and proposed a more social, relational, phenomenological, and critical approach. He argues that when it comes to experience and phenomenology of human-robot interactions, there is no such thing as a robot in itself, an object in itself, that can be defined independently from the observer or user, subject in itself, but rather a process in which object, subject, and indeed the moral standing or moral status of the robot are all outcomes, emerge from the process, relation, and interaction, rather than being given beforehand. Remember the first part of this lecture, where I explained different positions regarding the question of moral status of robots as agents or patients of moral action. Well, Coeckelbergh changed the question to one concerning moral status ascription and its conditions of possibility, including language, social relations, and technology. He have argued that moral status is not independent from our use of language, our already existing social relations and encounters, and the technologies we use, all of which shape our thinking about the moral standing and moral patiency of robots and other entities, including our often problematic categorizations and generalizations such as robot and animal. These enable a more critical perspective on moral status, indeed a critique of moral status ascription itself. Coeckelbergh have argued that the very project of determining moral standing of entities is problematic. Now, let's see why the very project of determining moral standing of entities is problematic. Coeckelbergh started by looking at the method used by those thinking about moral standing or moral patiency. Usually, philosophers use the following procedure. First, the question regarding the moral status of a particular entity is asked, and it is assumed that this is the question to ask and that there is nothing wrong with asking the question in this way. Then, the ontological status of the entity is determined, that is, what that entity is. And finally, the moral status is inferred from this ontological status. The reasoning of what Coeckelbergh have called the properties approach goes as follows. First, all entities of type A with properties P, Q, R have moral standing S. Second, entity X is of type A and has properties P, Q, R. Third, therefore, entity X has moral standing S. For example, all conscious entities have moral rights. This entity, for example, this robot, is not conscious. Therefore, this entity has no moral rights. Another example. Sentience is taken to be a prerequisite for rights. A robot is said to lack sentience. Thus, it is concluded that it cannot have moral rights. This reasoning raises some epistemological problems. Starting with the first premise, how can we be sure that all entities of a particular type have a particular kind of moral status? The history of morals shows that we were often mistaken about this, for example in the case of animals. Moreover, with regard to the second premise, how can we be sure that a particular entity has the morally relevant property in question? We cannot look into the head of an animal. we cannot really know what it experiences. A deeper problem, however, is with the procedure as such. It creates distance from the concrete entity and relation to that entity. By performing a kind of moral scientific dissection on the entity to reveal its ontological and moral properties, we, moral reasoners, moral philosophers, observers, and commentators, distance ourselves from the entity. We also proceed as if the entity can be defined in itself, independently of our thinking about the entity, the language we use to talk about the entity, and our current and or previous experiences with the entity, the relevant encounters, situations, interactions, and narratives. We reason as if our reasoning itself is not shaped by our relational experience, but our subjectivity is constituted by it, and the object is also shaped by the subject. Let's consider robots again. If I have a personal opinion about the moral status of robots, or even if I construct philosophical arguments about them, then this opinion is shaped by my experience of particular robots. It is also shaped by a language that uses the lump category robots, and does not differentiate between different kinds of robots. If I meet a robot, then this language of meeting already suggests human-like status, or at least social status. If we use it to speak about a robot, or a you to address it, or her, or him, or them, then this language shapes the status of the robot. That status is linguistically constructed in the sense that our relation to it is always mediated by language. In experiments involving the torture of robots, Kate Darling has also shown that under certain conditions, for example, people were first told a story that personalized the robots, people hesitate to smash robots. In these experiments, moral status is also a matter of ascription and construction. That is, the status depends on and is shaped by how people talk about the robots, and how the robots were treated depends on that talking thinking and on what kind of narratives were created before the encounter with the robot. For example, for your behavior toward robots, it matters if you are first told a personal friendship narrative or a Terminator narrative about robots. For researchers in the field of social robotics, the relational approach proposed implies that to address the problem of moral status, one should study how subject and object are entangled in various ways in the phenomenology and hermeneutics of moral status ascription and other activities and performances. Instead of hurrying to the tribunal of moral status and pronouncing our moral verdict on the entity, one should first study and better understand the structure and grammar of how we think about moral status. If language plays such an important role in the construction and emergence of moral status or moral standing, indeed, in the construction, production, and emergence of moral patience, then we will better use and integrate critical thinking about language in thinking about technology. Our moral stance with regard to robots depends on larger patterns in our culture that encourage certain ways of interpretation and action, rather than others. To conclude, by paying more attention to the phenomenology of how we perceive robots and interact with them, but also by studying this in a way that brings in the social, this relational approach may enable us to better understand our intuitions about and behavior toward robots. Now, the debate about sex robots and human relationships. We're going to explore especially some feminist or egalitarian questions. Sex robots are human-looking, often but not exclusively, female-looking animated dolls used for sex. They mimic human movements and some also react to human touch, movements, and talk. As their appearance gets more realistic and with the development of artificial intelligence, their range of capacities increases. Like other so-called social robots, they especially get better in language and communication. Arguments in favor of sex robots. In his book Love and Sex with Robots, David Levy emphasizes that using technologies for sex is nothing new. People have always been using sex toys, and the line between sophisticated sex dolls and sex robots is thin. Levy also argues that if the purpose of sex robots is for men to achieve orgasm, this aim is not different from the purpose of vibrators for women. In response to those who see human prostitution as degrading, it may be argued that sex robots should be welcome since they may liberate women from having to do this kind of work. Arguments against sex robots. Many of the objections against sex robots assume that there needs to be a link between sex and a relationship, an erotic relationship and or a love relationship. An erotic relationship or a love relationship involve more than what can be achieved with sex robots. And even from a less relational, more user-centered perspective, it is doubtful if the latter can truly satisfy its users' physical and emotional needs instead of merely manipulating their users. The argument that sex robots are not really capable of creating an erotic relationship is convincing. Coeckelbergh thinks, and I agree. Solins writes, the kind of relationships that are evolving are not philosophically erotic, that is, challenging and compassionate, but rather one-sided affairs overburdened by fleeting passions and the desire to erase everything in the beloved that is not a complete reflection of the lover's preconceived notions of what he or she thinks they want out of a partner. Remember the main lesson Socrates was trying to give us in the symposium is that we come into a relationship impoverished, only half knowing what we need. We can only find the philosophically erotic through the encounter with the complexity of the beloved. Complexity that not only includes passion, but may include a little pain and rejection from which we learn and grow. Defenders of sex robots could reply, however, that Sulin's argument confuses sex with an erotic relationship or with love, and that it is only an argument against love robots or erotic robots, but not against sex robots. But even then, one can try to argue that good sex involves more than what interaction with a sex robot can do. Moreover, one may wonder if the use of sex robots does not influence the image users have of women and human relationships. If and to the extent that users choose sex robots as a replacement of a human partner or an alternative for a human-human relationship, then this seems highly problematic because it remains a one-sided asymmetrical relationship and indeed invites the objection that the robot is used as a way to avoid difficult relationships and to have complete control over one's partner. From a feminist or egalitarian perspective, it has been claimed that robot prostitution is degrading for women, and problematic in other ways, since it projects a problematic image of human relationships and of women as sex robots, that is, as things, and promotes morally problematic relationships and practices. Richardson, who heads a campaign against sex robots, has argued that Levi's views and his use of prostitution work as a model for human-robot relations assume a problematic conception of prostitution, invite gender notions of sexuality, and promote the idea of using a person as a thing. Richardson criticizes the conception of prostitution as something positive and as sexual labor involving sex workers. In other words, that it is framed as a service. She notes that prostitution does not always involve consent, is often connected to violence and human trafficking, and often involves non-adults. Moreover, Richardson doubts if sex robots will help to reduce prostitution, noting that the growth of the Internet has not done this. Richardson argues that sex robots will further reinforce relations of power that do not recognize both parties as human subjects. Conclusions about from robotics and AI to thinking about moral status and human relationships. First, robots and their meanings are always tied to social relations. Second, we need to take seriously science fiction and fantasies since, and at least insofar as they are connected to real societal problems and influence real developments in robotics and elsewhere. Third, the discussion about sex robots invites us to reflect on the ethics of human relationships and encourages doing philosophy of technology in a way that engages with societal problems, including gender issues, but also thinking about human relationships. It is not only a discussion about robots, it is also a discussion about how we should reshape human-human relationships and society. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure teaching you this summer.